The bustling activity of the camp outside Dragonstone fell into an uneasy quiet as Varos stormed out of the war room, his expression dark and unreadable. His robes, streaked with black and red, billowed behind him as he moved with purpose through the throng of soldiers and officers. His fiery eyes burned with a mix of urgency and anger, the news of the missing wildlings weighing heavily on his mind. Daenerys, Robert, and Stannis stood on a raised platform near the camp's edge, discussing the plans for their next moves. Their attention turned sharply as they noticed Varos striding toward the cliffside where his dragons rested. The sheer determination in his steps made it clear he had no intention of staying. "What's he doing now?" Robert muttered, gripping the edge of the table before him. "The man's a mystery wrapped in flames." Daenerys's gaze followed Varos with concern, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Whatever it is, he's not waiting for us to decide." Without hesitation, Varos approached Maelstrom, his largest and most fearsome dragon. The colossal beast, its scales gleaming like dark steel and its wings spanning wide enough to cast an immense shadow over the camp, stirred at his master's presence. Without a word, Varos climbed atop the dragon's massive neck, his movements swift and practiced. The moment Varos mounted, Maelstrom let out a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath the camp. Soldiers scrambled for cover as the beast's wings unfurled, creating gusts so powerful they toppled tents, scattered supplies, and extinguished campfires. The massive dragon leapt into the air, its wings beating with a force that sent a shockwave through the encampment. Entire sections of the king's encampment were ruined in the dragon's ascent, leaving chaos in its wake. Robert shielded his eyes from the debris, his jaw slack as he watched the monstrous creature rise. "By the gods," he muttered, his voice barely audible. That thing isn't a dragon. It's a damned force of nature." Stannis stood beside him, his face stoic but his eyes betraying a hint of awe. "A force we're fortunate to have on our side," he said simply. Daenerys, her silver hair whipping in the wind caused by Maelstrom's takeoff, kept her gaze fixed on Varos. "He's going to Hardhome," she said quietly, almost to herself. "He knows the Night King is responsible for the missing wildlings." Robert turned to her, his tone incredulous. "Hardhome? Does he think he can take on the Night King alone with that beast?" Daenerys shook her head. "Varos doesn't act without purpose. If he's going, it's because he believes he must. And if Maelstrom flies, it's because he will not allow the Night King to go unchallenged." Above them, Maelstrom ascended higher, its silhouette eclipsing the sun as it soared northward with terrifying speed. The sight was both awe-inspiring and unnerving, the sheer size of the dragon making even Daenerys's 3 dragons seem small by comparison. Robert's voice was low but filled with wonder. "That thing could raise entire kingdoms in a single night." Stannis glanced at his brother, his voice measured. "Let us hope it never has to. If even Varos fears what's happening in the north, then we may be facing something far worse than we imagined." As Maelstrom disappeared over the horizon, the camp slowly began to recover from the dragon's chaotic departure. Soldiers and commanders moved to assess the damage, though many could only stand and stare, their faces pale with disbelief. Robert turned to Daenerys, his expression grim but laced with curiosity. "Your dragons are formidable, Targaryen, but that one, where did he come from?" Daenerys met his gaze, her voice steady. "Maelstrom is of old Valyria, a creature of a world long gone. Varos alone knows his full purpose. But if he's flying north, it's because he believes the Night King's threat demands it." Robert let out a heavy sigh, his hand resting on the hilt of his warhammer. "Then let's pray he's right, because if that beast fails, I don't think even dragons will save us from what's coming." The 3 leaders stood in silence, their gazes fixed on the northern sky where Varos and Maelstrom had disappeared. The ground still trembled faintly from the dragon's takeoff, a reminder of the sheer power that had just left their camp. Whatever awaited Varos at Hardhome, it was clear that the stakes had never been higher. The northern skies were alight with the fiery glow of 3 colossal dragons as they approached Hardhome. Maelstrom, the largest and most fearsome of them all, flew at the forefront, his massive wings slicing through the frigid air like blades. Behind him followed Scourge and Vermilion, their own primal power radiating as they closed in on the beleaguered camp below. Hardhome was chaos. Merchant ships crowded the shorelines, hastily evacuating wildlings onto their decks. The encampment was surrounded, with thousands of wights clawing at the gates and walls, their hollow eyes filled with an insatiable hunger. On a ridge above the fray, White Walkers on horseback watched with eerie calm, their icy spears glinting in the dim light. Their mere presence seemed to chill the air further, their intent unmistakable as they oversaw the slaughter. Then came the roar. It was deafening, otherworldly, and it shook the very ground of Hardhome. The wildlings froze, their eyes turning skyward as Maelstrom descended, his massive form blotting out the sun. His wings spread wide, casting a shadow so vast it covered the ridge where the White Walkers stood. The primal power of the dragon was undeniable. This was no mere creature. This was a force of nature, a living god of fire and fury. The White Walkers reacted, their snarls breaking the eerie silence. They raised their icy spears, readying themselves for the impossible confrontation. But Maelstrom gave them no chance. The dragon opened his maw, and a torrent of fire erupted, a flame so vast and intense it consumed everything in its path. The entire ridge was engulfed in a hellish inferno, the White Walkers obliterated before they could even throw their spears. The fire didn't stop there. It cascaded down, incinerating the wights clustered up to the very gates of Hardhome. The wildlings inside the camp stood frozen in awe and terror. They had heard of dragons, but this was something beyond their comprehension. Maelstrom's presence was overwhelming, his fire a divine wrath that burned away their enemies with terrifying ease. As Maelstrom circled back, Scourge and Vermilion moved in with precise coordination. Scourge, his black and molten orange scales gleaming like molten metal, unleashed his fire upon the wights pressing against the eastern wall. His flames roared with a feral intensity, reducing the undead to ash in moments. Vermilion, his crimson and gold form striking against the snow, targeted the western approach, his fire spreading across the wights like a tidal wave of destruction. The wildlings inside the camp fell to their knees, some in prayer, others in sheer disbelief. The dragons were not just creatures. They were symbols of power so ancient and primal that it felt as though the gods themselves had descended to Hardhome. These were not the dragons of Daenerys Targaryen. These were creatures of a forgotten age, embodiments of Valyrian might that had once ruled the skies. From the ships, the wildlings being evacuated watched in stunned silence. The merchant captains, many of whom had long dismissed dragons as myth, stared slack-jawed as the fiery onslaught unfolded before them. Even the sea seemed to tremble under the weight of the dragon's presence. As the last of the wights fell, incinerated by the relentless flames, Maelstrom let out another thunderous roar, a proclamation of victory and power that echoed across the icy wastes. Scourge and Vermilion circled above the camp, their own roars joining in a symphony of dominance. The battle was over and Hardhome was saved, for now. Varos, atop Maelstrom, looked down at the destruction with a grim satisfaction. He had seen the threat for what it was and acted without hesitation. The wildlings had been spared, but the cost of their salvation was the unshakable fear and reverence they now held for the dragons and their master. The three dragons ascended once more, their immense forms rising into the darkening skies. The fires they had left behind continued to burn, a beacon of survival in a land of death. As they flew back toward Dragonstone, the wildlings whispered amongst themselves, their voices trembling with awe. They weren't just dragons, one murmured. They were gods. But even gods could not rest, for the Night King and his endless horde were far from defeated. The battle at Hardhome was only the beginning. As Varos circled high above the icy wasteland on Maelstrom's back, flanked by Scourge and Vermilion, the aftermath of Hardhome's fiery salvation lay below. Smoke and ash rose from the scorched earth, and the remaining wildlings were hastily boarding the last of the merchant ships, their survival ensured for now. Varos's fiery gaze scanned the horizon. He was emboldened by his victory, the sheer destructive power of Maelstrom giving him confidence that even the Night King could not stand against him. His mind was set. If the Night King's army was near, he would end the threat then and there. He commanded the 3 dragons to fan out, their colossal forms casting vast shadows over the icy tundra as they searched for their foe. And then he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye, beyond the edge of the frozen wastes, a dark, writhing mass stretched endlessly across the horizon. It was not just an army, it was an ocean of death. Whites marched in perfect unison, their numbers so vast they seemed to blur together into one monstrous entity. Among them were giants, their hulking forms towering over the sea of undead. And worse still, there were creatures Varos had never seen before, grotesque abominations, twisted forms of dead beasts, their icy hides glinting in the pale light. Varos's breath caught for a moment as he assessed the scale of the threat. This was not the fragmented host he had just destroyed at Hardhome. This was the Night King's true force, an unstoppable tide of death, easily over 500,000 strong, marching toward the wall with an eerie, unrelenting purpose. He pulled on Maelstrom's reins, signaling a retreat. "Not yet," Varos muttered under his breath. "We can't face this here." But Maelstrom had other ideas. The massive dragon let out a thunderous roar that echoed across the valley, his primal instincts overriding Varos's command. This dragon was bred for war, forged in the fires of old Valyria, and he would not cower before any foe. Scourge and Vermilion, feeding off Maelstrom's ferocity, let out their own earth-shaking roars and descended alongside him. Before Varos could stop them, the 3 dragons plunged toward the valley, their immense forms slicing through the frigid air like bolts of fire-soaked lightning. "Damn it!" Varos cursed, gripping Maelstrom tightly as the dragon unleashed a torrent of flame. The fire swept across the valley in a single, devastating arc, consuming tens of thousands of whites in an instant. The blaze was so large and fierce that it could be seen from the wall, a searing line of fire against the icy expanse. The ground itself seemed to ignite, a massive inferno that illuminated the frozen night. The dragons continued their assault, circling back and unleashing wave after wave of dragonfire. Giants were reduced to ash, and the grotesque beasts were obliterated in the onslaught. The undead horde suffered tremendous losses, entire swathes of their numbers incinerated before they could react. But the tide of death was unyielding. For every white burned, more marched forward, an endless wave that defied comprehension. The sheer scale of the army was overwhelming, and the realization dawned on Varos. This was not a force that could be defeated by fire alone. "Enough, Maelstrom," Varos shouted, pulling hard on the reins. "We must fall back." The dragon resisted, his instinct to fight driving him forward, but Varos exerted his will, his fiery gaze locking onto the beasts. Finally, Maelstrom relented, letting out a frustrated growl as he ascended, retreating from the valley. Scourge and Vermilion followed suit, their own roars trailing off as they rose into the sky. As Varos turned back toward the wall, his heart was heavy with the knowledge of what he had seen. The Night King's army was still vast, its strength undiminished despite the devastating losses inflicted by the dragons. He had struck a powerful blow, but it was not enough. The true battle had yet to come. The wall loomed in the distance, its icy heights a symbol of the last line of defense for the living. The fiery blaze in the valley behind him still burned, a beacon of hope and desperation visible even from Castle Black. Varos guided Maelstrom toward the wall, his mind racing with the enormity of the threat they faced. He had hurt the Night King's army, but it was a mere fraction of what was needed. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher.